In my early years, life gave me a scene that I could never have imagined. I remember how, in the innocence of childhood, I witnessed an accident on the road that seemed suspended in time. In the middle of the chaos, a man lay on the pavement, and while confusion took over the crowd, an enigmatic figure stood out among them all. A man in black whose presence was so silent. What marked me the most was the moment when, bringing his wristwatch to his mouth, he murmured with a certainty that transcended logic, "Special delivery completed." That accident made me uncomfortable for two reasons, because of the investigation and because of death itself. In adolescence, I had a period when I was very obsessed with death. Not with Santa Muerte as such, because religious beliefs have never been my thing. In fact, I have a tattoo, only one. And it is precisely elusive to death. It's not a skull or anything like that. It's how to say a tattoo that mixes the concept of time with the concept of death. This is because death is the only thing that is timeless. No, life is not timeless because life can stop extending, yet death will always go wherever life is. When I was in high school, I submitted an essay to the local newspaper and they hired me. I worked there until about 20 years ago. It was a modest newspaper with only local reach, one of those that rarely anyone outside the municipality read. There I covered notes of all kinds: accidents, robberies, neighborhood meetings, anything that could be used to fill the day's edition. One day, after a strong flood caused by the overflow of the river, a body arrived at the morgue. The body itself was not so strange because after a storm like that, there was always some victim. But the strange thing was what they found among his belongings. The man was carrying a backpack with things that, at that time, no one could explain. A tablet, a smartwatch, a cell phone with a design too modern for the time, a t-shirt with the image of a pope modified in a dark way with the word ghost, and 2 Cinepolis tickets for the movie The Lion King. At that time, none of it made sense. The technology he carried was unknown to anyone yet, and besides, The Lion King was very old. It didn't make sense that he had movie tickets for that film. No one could explain the origin of those objects, not the police, nor the doctors, nor the journalists who came later to snoop around. But since my newspaper was local and didn't have much reach, the story stayed in the city, barely causing a stir among the inhabitants. That was the note that marked my life. The editor was surprised by my work, and from there, they commissioned me to cover news that had some paranormal or inexplicable nuance. I had to interview people who claimed to have seen things out of the ordinary, investigate places with a reputation for mystery, and try to make sense of testimonies that seemed to be taken from another world. Over time, some newspapers in neighboring cities became interested in what I wrote. Every time I published a strong story, I received calls offering me work elsewhere. That was how, after that first note, I ended up working for 8 newspapers in 8 different cities. In each one, I covered cases that defied all logic. It wasn't something I had planned, but it seemed that I had become the journalist of the strange. Among all the cases I investigated, there were a few that were as inexplicable as the one of the body in the morgue. And all those very particular cases always involved a body that arrived at the morgue. Not necessarily with strange objects on top, but they were strange bodies with unusual marks. For example, there was one whose autopsy on a baby revealed that the body had been dead longer than the number of months the baby would have been alive. The first case, that of the man with the strange backpack, had gone unnoticed for many years. But when I went back to the old files, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Among the morgue papers, there was a document with the signature of a person who had supposedly claimed the body, but that name was never in the hospital records or in the identification database, as if it had been someone who existed only at that time and then disappeared. In those cases, there was an even stranger detail. Some witness, whether direct or indirect, mentioned having seen a man dressed completely in black, always with a cap and dark glasses. It didn't matter the city or the year. Someone always described the same subject. I covered several of those cases. At first, I didn't give them much importance. They were just strange events that ended up in the morgue without much explanation. But when I saw that the same figure appeared in each story, I started to pay attention. The first one I investigated was in a city in the north. They notified me of a body that had arrived at the morgue with marks on the skin that looked like engravings. It had no identification or missing person report. The marks, according to the doctors, were not tattoos or recent wounds, but something that seemed to have been there for years. They were lines and symbols that no coroner could identify. One of the police officers who was at the scene told me that before they picked up the body, a man dressed in black with a cap and dark glasses had appeared among the people watching. No one knew who he was or why he was there. But when the officer tried to approach, the man simply got lost in the crowd. The case was never resolved. No one claimed the body, no one knew where it came from, and the symbols on his skin remained a mystery. When I published the story, someone sent me an anonymous message with an old newspaper clipping. It was about another body found years ago with similar marks. It caught my attention, but not enough to continue investigating, until another case occurred in a city to the south. A baby arrived at the morgue after being found lifeless in his crib. The mother was devastated, but the strangest thing was what they found in the autopsy. According to the age of the child, he was only months old, but the analysis of the body revealed signs of decomposition that indicated he had been dead for more than a year. The doctors had no logical explanation. How could a baby who was supposedly born half a year ago have been dead for longer? A nurse who worked at the morgue told me that the night they brought the body in, she saw a man dressed in black at the entrance. He didn't go in. He just stood there as if he was waiting for something. After I published the story, the baby's mother disappeared without a trace. It was then that I realized something didn't fit. I began to look for more cases of bodies with impossible data. People who shouldn't be dead, or who seem to have existed outside of any record. I found several, and in many of them, someone had mentioned the man in black. The case that confirmed my suspicion happened in another city. The police found a body in an alley. It had no signs of violence and seemed to have died of natural causes. They took him to the morgue, but when they tried to register his fingerprints in the system, they discovered that the same person had been declared dead 2 years earlier in a road accident in another state. An employee of the morgue mentioned that when they were preparing the body, a man in black walked down the hall and looked into the room. He didn't come closer. He didn't ask anything. He just watched for a few seconds, then left. When police tried to investigate further into the dead man's identity, the original accident file disappeared from the records. One night, while I was reviewing documents at the morgue, I saw something at the end of the hall. Someone with a cap and sunglasses was standing there, still. I stood up immediately, but when I tried to get closer, the figure was gone. That same night, I received a call from an unknown number. Nobody spoke. I only heard slow breathing before the communication was cut off. Obviously, all these cases have more depth, but if I expanded on them, my story would become too long. I've only told you the essentials so you can see the pattern. Each case had the presence of that mysterious man in black. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but as the pattern repeated over and over, I no longer knew what to believe. There were no photos or proof of his existence, only the testimonies of people who had seen him near the scenes of these strange events, always observing from a distance, never speaking to anyone. I never investigated more than necessary because I didn't want to become part of my own stories. In 2019, I decided that I'd had enough. I returned to my hometown as a retired journalist, leaving behind my work covering the inexplicable. I distanced myself from those topics, hoping to live the rest of my days in peace. But just days after returning, strange things began happening. First, an unmarked envelope was left at my door. Inside was a blurry photograph of a figure seen from behind, dressed in the same dark clothing that witnesses had described in my old articles. I ignored it. Then the next day, while drinking coffee in a cafe, a man wearing sunglasses and a black jacket passed by the window. He stopped for a moment, as if watching me. When I stepped outside to look for him, he was gone. Months later, the city braced itself for a hurricane, one stronger than anything we had seen before. In an attempt to clear my mind, I decided to sit in a park near the river. I know it might sound strange to go near the water when a hurricane is approaching, but I've always found nature comforting. As the sky darkened and the air thickened with the weight of the coming storm, a man appeared, dressed completely in black, wearing a cap and dark sunglasses. The moment I saw him, it was like déjà vu. He was the same man I had encountered years ago while investigating one of those anomalous cases. He approached me and, without hesitation, asked if I recognized a young man walking about 2 meters away, hand in hand with his girlfriend. I turned to look. To my utter shock, I recognized the young man immediately, because years ago I had covered the discovery of his corpse for the newspaper. Yet there he was, alive. He was wearing the same shirt with the word ghost, holding the same cell phone, and on his wrist was the very same smartwatch. The scene left me speechless. Before I could react, the man in black pulled out a gun and shot the girl. Blood spread across the pavement. The young man, driven by instinct, lunged at the attacker. But the man in black was stronger. He held him firmly, applied a precise hold, and ripped the cell phone from his hands, stuffing it into the backpack he carried. I watched everything unfold, unable to look away, completely paralyzed by disbelief. I wanted to act, but before I could, the man in black turned to me and calmly warned me not to interfere. According to him, that young man had already been found 20 years ago. The course of events had to continue without alteration. His words made no sense, but then he told me what to do. I had to call an ambulance to help the girl because, as he put it, she was not supposed to die. With trembling hands, I dialed emergency services while still watching in growing confusion. As I spoke on the phone, I saw the man in black, without hesitation, drag the young man, who was still breathing, toward the river. With unnatural strength, he threw him into the water, along with the backpack. The strangest thing was that there was no one else in the park, only the 4 of us. The storm had already scared everyone indoors. Shortly after, the man returned to the bench as if nothing had happened and explained something to me in a few simple words. His job was to make sure that certain special bodies reached the morgue. He didn't personally make the deliveries. He only ensured that everything was in the right place at the right time. According to him, some bodies had to move forward in time and others had to go back, maintaining a balance. That was when I finally understood. I thought back to the accident I had witnessed as a child, the one I mentioned at the beginning of my story. Back then, I had seen something I was not meant to see. I had unknowingly been close to one of these special bodies. My entire life, my career as a journalist covering inexplicable events, had been leading up to this moment. I had been an observer since childhood. As the clouds thickened and the hurricane loomed, the ambulance arrived to treat the girl. The police took the man in black into custody, and then, as a reddish streak of light from the storm illuminated the river, the man in black looked at me directly and said, "The body has been moved." Those sent a chill through me. The police charged him based on my testimony. I told them what I had understood, that he had shot the girl and thrown the young man into the river. They had no reason to doubt me, so he was declared guilty and locked away. A week passed. One quiet night, curiosity got the better of me, and I returned to the morgue, the same morgue where, years ago, I had first seen the corpse of that very same young man. Outside, I lit a cigarette, lost in thought, unable to reconcile the impossible. That's when a worker approached me. He introduced himself, but not as a simple employee. He claimed to be a high priest of death, not of Santa Muerte, but of death as an essence, as a force. He invited me inside. Intrigued, I followed him. We walked to a metal slab where a body lay covered by a sheet. When he pulled it back, I was stunned. It was him, the man in black, dead. The high priest looked at me and in simple words explained what had happened. The man in black had been marked by death. According to him, death sometimes chooses certain individuals to carry out acts that defy all reason. And just as death has its agents, it also has observers. My role had been that of a witness, to watch and record events that most would find incomprehensible or impossible to believe. Then the priest did something I couldn't have foreseen. He pulled out a pendant and placed it on the corpse's forehead. As he did, he said that the man's journey was not over yet. His first stop, the priest explained, would be a road accident. And then, right before my eyes, the corpse moved. Its fingers twitched, first one, then another. Then both hands clenched into fists. I left the morgue that night, more confused than ever, unable to understand even half of what had just happened. But one thing was clear. I had been a part of this all along.